May I just say one thing before we start? This is very unusual for me to be, typically if people were presenting on my work, I would be taking a long walk. In part because I really believe that when I publish a book, it becomes the property of the reader. That this is, the book is made between the reader and the text, and it's an intimate experience that is not really my business in a way. So I just want you guys to feel relaxed about what you're thinking is legitimate. And I've read your work and I have questions, but I'll be engaging maybe in the way that any reader might. So don't feel self-conscious about it. I'm not judging whether you're right or something.
It's reassuring.
Yeah, it's I think a new format for all of us, so we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much, Padma, and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful for me to be here this afternoon. In today's conference, I'll be observing the concepts of food, palatability, and socio-political discourses in Padma Viswanathan's The Ever After of Ashwin Rao. The novel explores the way in which fragments of past memories haunt the lives of the characters who have lost close companions and loved ones 20 years ago in the 1985 Air India tragedy. I will examine the novel's treatment of food and its connection to loss, memory, and nostalgia, with a focus on the characters Venkat, Sethuratnam, or as he's commonly referred to in the book as Seth, and Ashwin. Ashwin Rao, a psychotherapist by profession, revisits Canada in 2004, this time to interview victim families who have lost loved ones in the Air India Flight 182. For Ashwin, conducting such interviews is not simply an approach to gain recognition in his field, or merely to project the voices of such families. It is more of a need for him to understand the way in which people cope with loss, since Ashwin himself has not come to terms with recovery after losing his sister Kritika, his nephew Anand, and his niece Asha in the Air India bombing. Ashwin does not dredge up his sorrow or share his bereavement with others. Instead, he keeps it concealed. However, this does not prevent him from reminiscing about his sister or her children. One such example would be remembering Asha, for whom one thing always became another. When I say one thing always becoming another, I'm talking about memories of Asha's bitten sandwich that becomes a ship for her. In his house in Lohikarma, a fictional town in BC, Ashwin swirls his final shot of espresso into a pan of hot milk. Food, in the form of a beverage, has a symbolic function here, whereby the act of swirling in a circular, spiraled manner indirectly signals the notion of time traveling, and thereby the nostalgia that Ashwin is about to experience as he takes his coffee to drink in the window seat that has a view of the mountainside. The past seeps out of the mind's eye as narrative voice to describe how the wispy clouds drifting against the black-green mountainside is suffused with the remnants of Asha's bitten sandwich, which evokes the fragmented memories of a loved one. Food plays an important role in Ashwin's experience of nostalgia, whereby traces of a past memory connected with food lingers within a present space as the clouds of Lohikarma shift into a narrative of Asha's sandwich. Ashwin says that he is not like Asha, for whom one thing always became another, and yet, for him, the clouds become human figures that dance, smile, and then get pulled away from each other, as if to depict the abrupt loss of a loved one. Ashwin attaches primacy to memories of Asha's purity and childhood, and her ability to mark one thing out of another, a habit which Ashwin refuses to have while succumbing to it at the same time. This is also apparent when an unopened whiskey bottle becomes a Buckingham Palace guard for Ashwin. In this case, the commonality between Asha and Ashwin is linked by the concept of being creative with food and beverage. Food, as a significant part of nostalgia, is also evident when Seth decides to spend a leisurely Sunday afternoon in front of the TV with family and a full thali of rice meal and 2 side dishes. A theorist by the name of Ketu Katrak suggests that narratives that are linked with nostalgia often depict immigrant memories and imagined returns to the homeland. And this idea is relevant to Seth, whereby the affective or the emotional value of nostalgia is infused in his touch as he mashes rice into okra sambar and lentils imbued with tamarind, cumin, coriander, and coconut. In Sethuratnam's case, the physical ingestion of food is briefly replaced by a more tactile form of consumption that generates a longing for continual stability and rootedness in the nation state, which remains unstirred by time. Such longing for the past shifts into a straddling of the past and the present, generated by Sethuratnam's act of smelling and tasting the food, depicted as a recipe for time travel, whereupon the affective value of taste triggers the simultaneous experience of living in an imagined past and a present reality. While Sethuratnam's nostalgia is inclined towards his nation-state, Ashwin reminisces about lost family members in the Air India flight. As apparent in the novel, Seth has the option to travel to India, but Ashwin's irrevocable loss only leaves him with fragmented memories of his loved ones. The fragrance of food as olfactory element also becomes a part of Ashwin's memories as he recalls Asha's smell of green grapes with a hint of nutmeg. However, this memory is swiftly fanned away by him, as if to quell the smell and suppress the past. Sometimes, he allows for Asha's memory to linger for a while. Other times, he drives it away. Instead of a palliative for loss, memories of Asha exacerbates Ashwin's sorrow while reminding him of his inability to recover. In relation to talking about a loved one, he wonders why some allow loss to seep into life's floodplains, while others erect a dam. Ashwin abides by the latter, more or less, throughout the novel, where in dredging up the experiences of victim families, he stifles his own grief through silence. A similar point could be made about his treatment of the unwanted odor of food, not the whiff of nutmeg associated with Asha, but the smell of spinach during the time of dawn in Lohi Karma. After removing his kurta, Ashwin senses a smell from his own pores, something dark and leafy, cooked spinach, and it is with a tang of iron. The term dark in the quote not only contrasts with the dawn of Lohi Karma, but connotes a sense of negativity, which is further implied through Ashwin saying that he gagged a little, as if to rid himself of the unpleasant smell of spinach that has confined him. Alongside water, it takes 6 various washing products to suppress the smell. The persistence of the smell of unwanted food is evident as by night the spinach would chew its way to the surface again, as if to forcibly dredge itself up with the motive of lingering till dawn. The smell spills across the domains of the body despite Ashwin's efforts to cause his body to hide it. However, using an alternate strategy from that of applying 6 different products, Ashwin quells the smell with alcoholic beverage. Moreover, in the scene that follows, his second and final shot of espresso not only signifies day-to-day life, but serves as a non-alcoholic morning drink to quell any traces of the smell of spinach. Therefore, Ashwin's way of coping with negativity trauma, or a crisis is through concealing or suppressing the sorrowful and the unwanted, be it the odor of food or the loss of family. However, unlike Ashwin, Seth speaks of his loss of Sundar, who was no less than a son to him. Seth fulfilled the role of a playful father who used to appear on his hands and knees for Sundar to experience the childlike game of horsey ride, a form of amusement that was not on Venkat's agenda as father. 20 years after the Air India bombing, Seth interacts with Ashwin about Sundar's unwavering determination to eat a fish that he had caught during a family trip. Seth's willingness to talk contrasts with Venkat's reluctance to speak about the loss of his wife Sita and his son Sundar. As Ashwin observes, Venkat, quote, thinks about what happened in ways that allow him not to think about what happened, unquote. Venkat disentangles the personal from the political, only to suppress the personal while speaking at length about the political. This is evident when Ashwin attends a gathering at Sethuratnam's house on the anniversary of the Air India tragedy. After the prayer ceremony, Lakshmi ushers the guests and devotees towards the buffet as a plate is handed to each person. The food that is served brings bodies together in order for guests to both eat and converse within a social space amidst a somber yet warm atmosphere. While the prayer ceremony allows for individuals to contemplate one's loss at a personal level, the post-prayer dinner holds up a space for interaction where the personal, professional, and the social integrate in the form of sharing stories, exchanging memories, and talking about quotidian life. One such example would be the school principal Kaj, who takes an interest in Ashwin's project, which he comes to know of through Seth. Food, in this scenario, also instigates warmth and cordiality as guests compliment Lakshmi on the palatable dishes that she has prepared. This also indicates the way in which food is mediated by sexuality, where cooking and the domestic arena are frequently associated with femininity, as the diasporic married woman reproduces culture through home-cooked food. However, within this social space of remembrance and memory, the personal and the cordial are extricated and replaced by the political, whereby Venkat's voice rises above the dinner chat as he castigates Canada's marginalization of the Air India bombing, which contrasts with the effusive security measurements that were imposed during 9/11. Venkat brings up issues pertaining to citizenship and identity and how bodies are marked, classified, and positioned in accordance with race. This is clear as he speaks of Sundar, who was born and raised in Canada, and Venkat's wife Sita, who was, or still is, a Canadian citizen. Here, Venkat does touch on the personal, but only to reinforce the political. Seth and his daughter Brinda join in the conversation, but the discussion is predominantly Venkat's, who condemns the Sikhs and a certain Miss D for her supposed inevitable collaboration with the accused bombers. The shifting significance of food is worth noting in this section that focuses on the anniversary meal. The main course of basmati rice that is served as part of the meal blends in with the personal and the social as each person, with a plate of food at hand, speaks of projects, stories, and memories while eating intermittently. There are no physical constraints of a seated dinner as guests and devotees gather around the kitchen table or sit on the family room sofa with plates balancing on their laps. The palatability of basmati rice may also act as a palliative for sorrow, or as a recipe for time travel into a past homeland. Basmati, as a signifier of a social gathering on the anniversary of the tragedy, slips into the political as Venkat's voice travels across the family room sofa and the kitchen table. Henceforth, his voice prevails till dinner is over. Throughout the novel, his outspoken ideals, pertinent to the bombing, are usually accompanied by homemade food, be it basmati rice, Lakshmi's idlis, or fresh hot onion bhajis from his sister-in-law, Parvati, back in India. A dinner chat or a conversation over evening snacks form a liminal space within a physical setting for Venkat to contemplate his personal loss through the mode of political discourse. The notion of mobility is associated with food, as the relation between meals and political discourse travels across geographical boundaries into India. Moreover, home-cooked meals as recipes for time travel cause borders to become fluid through the simultaneous straddling of the past and the present. Mobility is also connected to the smell of food, both in the form of a lingering memory of a loved one and the odor of unwanted spinach that travels to the surface of the body. The ubiquity of food is also evident as present backdrops are imprinted with past memories affiliated with food. While Seth, in his third-floor office, recalls Sundar catching a fish, Ashwin reminisces of his niece Asha, for whom her bitten sandwich became a ship. For Venkat, food formulates a space for remembering his wife and child through dogmatic ideals. Food, in Padma Viswanathan's novel, becomes an important part of a character's remembrance of a loved one from the Air India tragedy, be it through food-related memories or over a dinner chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamika.
On to the next. Okay. So I'll just jump right in. If I'm speaking too fast, I apologize in advance. Okay. Engaging with pejorative effects following the traumatic bombing of Air India Flight 182, this presentation seeks to provide a critical response to the nostalgic presence of children after moments of loss, and Padma Viswanathan is the other after Ashwin Rao. Narrated by Ashwin Rao, a psychotherapist collecting trauma narratives and studying comparative grief. The novel explores the melancholic affects that emerged after the Air India tragedy, specifically addressing the ways in which the racialization of trauma may disrupt and challenge feelings of belonging inside the host nation. Compelled to interact with Venkat, a physics professor who lost his family on the flight, Ashwin attempts to rediscover his narrative with the help of Seed and offer ways to reduce the severity of his loss and transgenerational trauma. With this in mind, I will establish my reading of children and the trauma that unfolds after loss, providing particular attention to Venkat's narrative and the loss of his son Sundar. By focusing on discourses of infantilism by loss, I contend that the manifestations of ghostly children as an extension of recollected memories illuminates a promising understanding of the politics of loss, since the death of the child not only provokes the performativity of loss in their parents, but also enables the embodiment of inevitable trauma. So, grounding my argument in Catherine Bond Stockton's examination of the birthing effects of children, I argue that the loss of a child conceives a moment of rebirth, a moment which births grief and melancholia within their parents. Throughout her chapter, Oedipus Raced, or The Child Queered by Color, Bond Stockton illuminates the reciprocity between racialized children and their parents, arguing how, quote, children birth their parents as if parents, in a crazy kind of lateral, are newly made when their children turn against them, end quote. This turning against in her analysis is largely contingent on the enactment of violence by the child. which consequently not only fosters the destruction of familial lines, but also enables the suspension of futurity. I'd like to situate von Stockton's concept of turning against by applying it directly to discourses of death, loss, and grief. Instead of examining the child inflicting this violence on other bodies and the possibility of a suspended and violent future, I will examine how the violence inflicted on the child, in other words, death, disrupts and erases the progression of familial futures. This is precisely where the ghostly apparition of the child takes form. The death of the child takes on another form, thereby birthing the performativity of loss, with the specter of the child embodied within the parent. With this framework, I will explore how Sundar's death in the area of tragedy perpetuates a birthing effect in his father Venkat, arguing that bearing witness to this trauma becomes an embodied experience of witnessing. In order to understand my analysis of the death of the child and its effects on the parent more aptly, I need to discuss the role of the male child in the creation of new ties within the host nation. Second-generation children in migrant families often embody the tensions between the home and host nations, insofar as adults posit both relations of pastness and futurity onto the child. Yet these tensions between pastness and futurity, I argue, are reliant on discourses of reproductivity not only culturally assigned by the home nation, but also those highly influenced by the host nation. Migrant children, especially boys, are trying to navigate the reproductive tenors of brown masculinity within a predominantly white nationalist discourse. Although they are often directed by their parents to align themselves towards a traditional masculine performance, they are also compelled to entrench hybridized familial roots into a Canadian imaginary. Thus, the binaries between pastness, futurity, children, adults are always at odds, asserting the need for first and second generational migrants to negotiate discourses of reproductivity in the host nation. More pertinent to my discussion, children, according to Stockton, have always been, quote, specters of who we were when there was nothing yet behind us, end quote. I would like to argue further that the child, as representative of the parent, occupies the potential of looking behind us, while also constituting the recognition of the future. In other words, I am suggesting that the past manifests itself in the child through the possibility of a future. Therefore, the reproduction of the child, through its various interpretations, attempts to create new memories within a national narrative, employing an imperative connection between migrant bodies and the national spaces they occupy. So, through the use of my methodological approach, I would like to investigate a quote from the novel that inspired my argument entirely. Here, Venkat was staring out the window, hunched and small-looking. It was strange to see him reduced to infantilism by loss, needing to be told to eat and bathe, and occasionally making demands he knew everyone would run to fulfill. Maybe the adult Venkat would return when they hit the Irish shore. With his family in the vicinity, perhaps he would be restored to his old bossiness, which Seth was almost starting to miss. That's on page 128, if you have the copy. Here, Venkat, following the loss of his son Sundar and wife Sita on the Air India Flight 182, embodies an infantilism that manifests as a response to acknowledging and witnessing his loss. This becomes an excellent entry point from which to contextualize the exhibition of the ghostly child and transgenerational trauma. In focusing on the manifestations of memories and ghosts, I am suggesting that Sundar's ghost directly haunts Venkat. That is, he finds himself unable to comprehend the extent of his loss and therefore begins to perform a childish and infantilized identity. It is precisely this moment in which ghosts become an extension of loss. The migrant body, which has already experienced the inevitability of loss through migration, and other moments of physical and psychical injuries, must learn to accept the loss of the child, familial bonds, and connections made with the host nation. This loss, I propose, enables the haunting effects of the past through the enactment of recollected memories and the suspension of a possible future. With this in mind, it seems that these connections with the host nation are conditional on the reproductive promises assigned to the male child. Throughout Seeth's articulation of Venkat and Sundar, for example, he claims, quote, "I have 2 girls, no complaints, but I was very attached to Sundar, different, you know, a boy. Even before I had my daughters, I used to play with them. Venkat is not the type, too much the type to give horsey rides, that kind of thing," end quote. This statement not only addresses Venkat's identity as a strict patriarchal parent, unwilling to give horsey rides, but also emphasizes the need to remember loss through processes of storytelling and recollected memories. In addition, there is a line of attachment being drawn between both Sundar and Seeth, since they are both male and likely to play with one another. In pointing out the differences between Sundar and his daughters, Seeth reaffirms the value that maleness encompasses in the larger discourse of Canadian nationalism and traditional familial alliances. With this, I propose that the death of the child, along with the lost promises exchanged by their maleness, provokes a crisis that forces the parent and other adults to transform. Simply put, the haunting ghost of the male child is contingent on the memories of Venkat, and Seeth, in this particular example, is compelled to recollect and share with others. On the contrary, however, this desire to recollect memories becomes difficult to negotiate because trauma often forces the suppression of some memories while also enabling others to emerge to the surface. Thus, the embodiment of past memories, I suggest, significantly effeminizes and more specifically infantilizes Venkat, the patriarch, for having failed to protect his family. From this analysis, I would like to state that the body, through the witnessing of trauma, exceeds the limitations of the Performative Speech Act by adopting a bodily form of communication that becomes a responsibility for Seeth and Lakshmi. Lakshmi being Seeth's wife. It is indeed this shift of responsibility that translates this embodied trauma into a feasible narrative, since Seeth and Lakshmi are subsequently sharing this narrative with Ashwin Rao. Through enabling the shift of responsibility, Venkat arguably adopts a vulnerability that minimizes his identity as a normal patriarchal figure. Ashwin states further, quote, "Did Venkat say, Seeth, I'm not a baby? No. As an Indian man and a psychologist, I will attest that there are very few useful generalizations to be made about the Indian male's psyche, but this may be one. Indian men are raised to be cared for," end quote. Unlike Venkat's previous bossy attitude, he accepts Seeth's orders. Yet, the difference in this particular instance lies in the vulnerabilities that emerge as part of witnessing the death of the child. Ashwin then utters that, quote, "One other generalization to be made about Indians, they don't tiptoe around death," end quote. Rather than expressing his grief through performing a violent masculinity, Venkat needs to be given direction by his cousins in order to settle once again. Following the difficult news, Venkat, along with Seeth, eagerly wait for the retrieval of the bodies in order to confirm the death of his son. Up until this point, Venkat can only remember Sundar through the fragmentation of recollected childhood memories. In fact, Seeth describes how, quote, "Venkat looked expectant in a way a child waiting for a dentist or a teacher to administer an exam, passive but ready," end quote. Although Venkat in this particular instance musters up the strength to bear witness to his son's trauma, he is still quite hesitant. This is because, as stated by Sarah Ahmed, quote, "Mourning would involve at least 2 deaths. If someone has died, that person must be declared dead for the death to be real," end quote. For Venkat, this is precisely why he needs to travel to Ireland. It is not enough to be told his son is dead, since he must actively see Sundar and Sita for himself and offer them ritualistic burials. Ahmed states further that, quote, the second death would be the first death for the mourner. The object must be recognized as dead for death to become real, end quote. In accordance with Ahmed, I would like to argue further that there are 3 deaths involved in the process of witnessing. The death of the child, the recognition of his death, and, as I have argued previously, Venkat's loss of identity as patriarch. Sundar's death in this instance becomes real only by virtue of its reciprocity with Venkat. In order to make sense of his loss and therefore his childish identity, Venkat cannot grieve alone. There must be someone to bear witness to these sudden shifts in Venkat's identity. Relatedly, they see Sundar's body in seemingly different ways. Although Sith sees nothing but fear in his face, Venkat claims that he seems so peaceful. The narrative then states, quote, was Venkat seeing Sundar as he remembered him, rather than now as he was? But when did Sundar ever look peaceful, end quote. There is a dissonance at play here where Venkat, rather than acknowledging the visceral trauma inflicted onto his son's body, chooses to remember a time in which Sundar looked peaceful. This statement does not necessarily imply a resistance to his loss, but might alternatively represent his own method of recognition. That is, Venkat finds comfort in recognizing and remembering his child when he was merely sleeping. Sleeping for Venkat encapsulates the very essence of his son, a moment in which Sundar's childhood can be best described. After attempting suicide and subsequently directing his reason for earning to his bird, Mandy, Venkat finally decides to migrate back to India. Unfortunately, however, returning to the homeland will not guarantee that he will escape his grief and anger, but might instead, for a moment, suspend it. This desire to return home complicates his position as survivor, since his consciousness has already nonetheless been marked by tragedy and nostalgia for his family. By illuminating processes of embodied witnessing, this paper served to theorize Venkat's infantilized identity through the birthing effects of loss, death, and grief. Through childhood trauma and diasporic studies, I have offered an alternative method to conceptualize and investigate Venkat's survival narrative and loss amidst the Aryan tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have about 25 minutes for Padma to respond and then also to open up the discussion. So I don't know if you are speaking to them specifically or you want to direct your questions elsewhere.
Sure, I mean, you've both taken up very different realms within the book, so maybe it makes sense for me to sort of take up each of your arguments separately. So, Shamika, yeah, it's interesting. I had not thought about food in the way that you describe it, even though the book opens actually with a scene of Ashwin putting biryani out for this cat that he looks after, which is, one of his few tender gestures. And as so often with Ashwin's tender gestures go unwitnessed and, likely denied. But I think you're right in suggesting that Ashwin has this, Ashwin sort of simultaneously rejects the nostalgic value of food while falling prey to it in other ways, right? And so you see this with this gesture, I suppose, with the biryani. He often denies himself the luxury of nostalgic imagining. The one conduit he really accepts, also I haven't seen that with the espresso whiskey for him, is definitely the way once a year he allows himself to sort of descend into maudlin recollection, and the rest of the time he's trying to push it away, even though he appreciates food. And there are other, a few other scenes I'm sure you didn't have time to take up. One where he's in a diner in Lohi Karma, and he witnesses this woman is there who is, she orders an apple juice. And this is actually something I transposed from, was Union Station in New York, I think. I saw a woman sit down in a cafe in a fast food place and take out a mirror and start plucking hairs from her chin. My son was with me, actually. My whole family was with me. Yeah, you guys didn't see this. But I was staring at this woman plucking hairs until she was ushered out of there by, by the wait staff, because apparently you can't tweeze in a cafe. And Ashwin tends to, even when he has food in front of him, he's more interested in observing the people around him, whereas Saith permits himself to descend into the nostalgia of food. Saith is much more comfortable in his identity, right, than Ashwin is. And I'm sure I was probably aware of that. I mean, it's always a question for the writer how much of these sort of analytic frameworks you're aware of as you're writing. I tend to think it's much more that because also the book at various points, Ashwin disappears from the narrative, and you're simply within Saith's perspective, a close third person. It's no longer first person, but still you're within Saith's body. And so within Saith's body, it wasn't difficult for me to feel how the food would work on him. But of course, I'm not the only writer to have suggested that food or scent is a conduit to memory, right? I mean, this thali is Saith's Madeleine in a very real way. Other aspects of it, again, the bitten sandwich. Okay, so just the bitten sandwich, as you saw, Ashwin recalls his niece, Asha, who he lost aboard the plane, as having a particular talent with visual metaphor. And the way he describes this is that she saw a ship in her bitten sandwich, always one thing became another. And I guess I hadn't recognized until you were describing the way he talks about this, that he is sort of simultaneously denying his metaphoric talents, or the way that he sees the world metaphorically, even while he employs metaphors, right, continuously, as with the whiskey, as with the clouds, and so on. But I hadn't seen the sandwich as food. I had seen the sandwich as a transformable object in some way. Similarly, with his own scent, or with Asha's scents, these are simply, I think, scents available in the world that I didn't feel had a particular sort of association. It's just, I tend to interact with the world very much through smell, and I know how everybody who's close to me, they have this particular sort of, scent world that they carry with them. And so those were the ways that those things evolved for me. Also, for Ashwin, this becomes part of his therapeutic practice, as you know, that he, and he's not, Abraham Verghese talks about this in The Tennis Partner, about the value of scent to a clinician in detecting certain maladies. They do have smells. And so Ashwin also can tell to some extent if people are on certain kinds of drugs, if people are prey to certain kinds of disorders. He believes, anyway, that he can take this in. The two other things that occurred to me as you were speaking, you touched on the meal that Lakshmi presents. You presented one of them, the anniversary dinners. There's also another instance in which Ashwin happens on them, Saith and Lakshmi invites him in, and she puts a plate in front of him. And if you read the book, you know that Lakshmi is, in a mild way, an object of erotic fixation for Ashwin. He sort of has different kinds of crushes on both Saith and Lakshmi. And so, I felt as though you touched on this, but moved quickly to Venkat, this idea of how Lakshmi is the bearer of this sort of nostalgia, and that, this also is sort of entwined with her erotic presence in some way, that feminine force. And she is really the key figure between these three very different masculine entities, right? Ashwin, Saith, and Venkat, each of them is sort of a full person, a full man in a very different way, one from another, and each of them has this kind of relationship to the feminine, also with their daughters, who we, I suppose we'll talk about that more when we get to Joel's piece. I guess I was curious to know how you, if you had any reading, Shamika, of Ashwin's sort of complicated relationship to recollection and his own, currently through most of the book, his love life is quite barren, right? And I was wondering if you had any thoughts perhaps on, food and sensuality as it related to his sort of denial of human connection or his lack of ability to sustain romantic connection. Did you think in those terms at all, or?
I actually did, because I think in one of the coffee houses in Lohi Karma, he does smell or witness I think lemon square bars and sort of other forms of cakes and pastries, and then when he smells them, or the sight and the smell, I think both kind of make him think about Rosalind, who was the woman who he was in a relationship with before going back to India. So that instantly kind of makes him think about Rosalind and sort of the times that they used to spend together. So I think, again, that role of nostalgia comes back, but this time it's not for the Air India tragedy, but it's directed more towards thinking about a loved one, which is also, again, another form of loss whereby he wasn't able to sort of sustain the relationship with Rosalind.
Right, I suppose the loss of those foods is also a loss of certain kinds of social contact, which Lakshmi then restores in some way as the maker of those social scenarios. And Venkat also has a slightly complicated relationship to food. You describe his relationship to food as sort of allowing it to be an occasion for him to discourse on his political ideals. And again, this is a book I haven't read myself for a couple of years, but as I recall, there's an instance where when they come back from India, is that right? And they drop into their friends in Vancouver, and the friend serves them a meal, and Venkat receives his meal. For the first time, he starts monologuing on his sort of newly adopted politics. He's starting to stray towards Hindu nationalism at this point, right? And it's over a meal that he's done. It's interesting, the connections.
And then Seth also sort of looks down at his plate, which again shows that you have to sort of look down at your food for, sort of avoid a situation or a conversation that you might not feel comfortable having at that point.
So he probably just wants to be allowed to enjoy his food and think it's going off about it. Yeah. Nice. I had a few other things about Sita and her complicated relationship also to her body and to
I wanted to actually include Sita, but then due to time constraints, I thought that maybe not. But I was thinking about her character because I remember Seth referring to her as the good wife and the good cook as well. So again, that notion of domesticity and food sort of affiliated with femininity. And then later on, when she has that transformation after losing her son Sundar, she not only transforms physically by sort of cutting her hair and maybe changing her outfit, she also changes the kind of food that she eats. So the recipes changed as well, and then that idea of domesticity is not there at all.
Although there is my mother had told me this story about how somebody brought from India the culture that people needed here to make
I was thinking about that.
Yogurt, yeah, exactly.
Smuggled the yogurt.
Yeah, for a very long time we couldn't make yogurt at home until somebody finally brought this little bit, and literally brought the culture to here, right? And they talk about it. I can't remember if Sita has it or if they're just making yogurt at home, and so Lakshmi recalls it or something. So there is still just a tiny bit of connection, even though she's emaciated and clearly food is no longer a sensual pleasure for her. She's divorced herself from that and from the pleasure, or from the role of giving that pleasure to others, because all of that has been sort of excised from her identity in some way, but still there's the recollection of that possibility. Well, thank you.
Thank you for your insightful response. This really helps it helped for me to think about the novel in a different perspective as well. Thank you so much, Padma.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Joel. John Stewart or whatever he is now. So this was, again, when I first started reading your piece, I'd completely forgotten about that quote in my own book.
The Infantilism by Law?
Yes, of course.
It's one that just stuck with me
right
from the very beginning. because I do focus on children
Okay.
in texts, usually queer children.
Uh-huh.
But I gravitate towards that in every text. It appears everywhere. No one really catches on to it.
Uh-huh. Which does this notion of loss as infantilizing, or the person
Yes.
who is grieving as
Yes.
being returned to a state of
And I brought in
state.
this metaphor of the ghostly child as a metaphor for memories.
Mm-hmm.
And even though Sundar is a young adult when he passes on the plane, there's still that desire to go back to his childhood.
They still, for who to go back to?
For Venkat specifically.
To go back to Sundar's childhood, yes, it's actually very beautiful that you conclude on that moment. And, you know, again, it hadn't occurred to me that Venkat, in that moment, briefly, is being returned really to the perceiving parent, right? As opposed to what he has been from the moment of the bombing until then, a sort of a child in Said's care, right? In that moment, suddenly the sort of sense of authority switches from
Yes.
Said. Said suddenly sees Venkat as somebody who is able to perceive as a parent in a way that Said himself possibly is not, although, you know, as you say, he's also presenting to Sundar, throughout Sundar's life, another version of the father, right? An alternative to Venkat's. I mean, I think you use a certain phrase of a sort of normal patriarchal figure in some way. Is that how you see Venkat then? Is that Venkat's self-imagining, or is that your way of seeing him?
It's more it's my interpretation at that point. Because he does portray this strict patriarchal figure, and he's unwilling to play with his son at that point, but that becomes a regret later on. And that loss compels him to move back to this embody this childish identity to this point. And that's what I was interested in at that point, and how the patriarchal man goes back and embodies that.
Yeah, it undergoes a kind of reversion. I mean, that was something I was a little more conscious of. Constructions of masculinity in the novel was something, and I think both Said and Venkat see themselves as normative in some ways. I mean, I think Said sees himself as coming out of, as holding traditional values, for example. I mean, I think Said also would have played with his daughters similarly to, you know, he's a playful, sort of affectionate father, you know, one that feels intimacy to be important, something he wanted, something he feels his wife facilitates, actually. I mean, it's not that he finds this as easy for him to access, but it is something he desires in a way that Venkat probably, you know, didn't value in the same way that Said did. But it is also true that Sundar, and this is something, again, I was curious to see if this would come up, and maybe, you know, if you were ever to write more about this, which I'm not asking you to do, but that, you know, Sundar does have a special place as the only boy in this dyad of families, right? That there's the one boy and two girls, and he's the elder as well. So for everybody, he's the kind of golden child, right, in some way. And he's his own kind of masculine. That, you know, his father wants him to follow a certain path, and so he's following it. But yes, exactly. He's in engineering school, but simultaneously going to improv classes and making films, right? That he's able simultaneously to, and I'm sure Sundar, that Said and Lakshmi might want to believe that Sundar might have eventually said something about the influence of their family in this, which had, you know, for me to do with the ways that, as I think I might have talked about a little bit in the other session, the ways that our families adopted each other, other families, as relatives. And, you know, as closer with a number of families I'm not related to, who I grew up with, as I am with, you know, blood relatives, that people we were witnesses to each other's growth, and I was intimately influenced by these other families and by their ideas of what is traditional, what is normative, what is masculine or feminine, you know, aware of the variety between those families, all of whom considered themselves to be equally sort of normative, right? I think I was also curious about the ways that your paper was talking about the gap in identity between what Venkat was as a father and what he is as a father, or what he is as anything now that the child is gone. That this reversion has to do with filling a void
in the
left.
space,
Yeah.
yes, because there's another pertinent quote that I wasn't able to include about his reason for earning. His child and his wife was his reason for earning. And so he needs to shift that to something else. He does that with his birds. And the birds too are described as toddlers at one point. So there's that imagery as well. That connection is made for us. Yeah, you. And just building on that, and then his birds pass away and he decides to migrate back to India. So that void is not, he needs something else to fill that void. But in the end, we don't know what he decides to do exactly.
I kind of know, but
Share.
I was very struck by that Von Stockton quote. Would you mind quoting it again about
Children and birth, okay.
No, the second one about with no history behind us. What the child is the parent before the parent had history behind them. Is that what the quote is? It's toward the end.
Right. The specters of who we were when there was nothing yet behind us.
Yes, the specters of who we were when there is nothing yet behind us. That's the definition of the child. And as you were, I mean, it struck me as very poetic the first time I read it, but then as you read it this time, it struck me not only as poetic, but as positioned quite differently for immigrant families, right? Because I think the hardest thing for our parents was to try to imagine what we were supposed to be, what childhood was. I think my parents had the feeling that their parents had a much stronger sense of what was right, of what was, what to surround them with, about how to guide them, how to create those histories behind them. And, all of us want for our kids to, do all the things we weren't able to do to kind of, paint over our own regrets in some way, until they start developing regrets. So I'm gesturing at my poor son, he's enjoying this book here. And I think that, but I do think this notion of imagining your child's future becomes very different for my parents. It was very different from my parents' generation, much more problematic certainly than it is even for me, even while that both might be true for any of us. The final thing I was curious about was about Venkat's. You brought up the point that Venkat, and I again not remember this specifically, that Venkat starts to regret not having been softer with Sundar, is that right? Not having been, I mean, the moment I sometimes think of, this is the kind of thing that happens when you're writing. I was inside Venkat. Venkat finds out that Brinda, Saith's daughter, has left her husband, and it's at dinner, so this is an intersection. It's at some holiday dinner, Christmas or Thanksgiving or something, and Venkat finds out that Brinda's getting a divorce, and he starts monologuing about divorce, and Brinda gets overcome and starts crying, and he immediately regrets it. He's like, I'm so sorry, what's wrong, and she flees the table, and he says, oh, she's such a good girl, they're like daughters to me. And this was one of those moments when my character startled me. I didn't necessarily know that was coming from Brinda. It made sense to me that that's what she would do. I didn't know that Venkat was going to react that way, but I think it was that sort of crack of tenderness in that facade that he seems always to be trying to create his own carapace of masculinity continually, and it doesn't fit him perfectly. And these are the moments, I think, when he's confronted by that child, who he does have the tenderness for, they are like daughters to him, that it cracks, and you see that. That's the moment when I sort of remember to love Venkat, as even though Venkat is the toughest person to love in this, it reminds me to love him, to have compassion for him.